Hi and welcome to History Makers. I'm Matt Prater. Today we're chatting with musician and singer-songwriter Jon Seccombe, based in Sydney, Australia. Welcome along, John. Tell us a bit of your background. Where were you born and raised?
I was born in an obscure little country town called Wollongbar, which is in the far north coast of New South Wales. Around about the age of 5, The government contacted our family and said, "We love the land that you've been raised on and we'd like to build a university there." So my father had to move. We had no choice about that. They never built the university there, but there's a lovely TAFE there to this day on our property, and sometimes I drive past it and think of what it might have been and whether I would have been a farmer the rest of my life. But I think that's God operating, and down to Sydney we went. I went to just a local high school and primary school, firstly, and was due to go to a local high school. And one morning my father saw an ad in the paper, looked at it and said, "Put your best clothes on." He never really even asked me about it. I said, "Okay then." Off we went into town, and I did an audition and sang at St Andrew's Cathedral Choir and was accepted as a probationer there. I don't think my parents were really rich enough to afford the fees, so they had scholarships for students there and singing in the choir. So I spent the next 6 years, and it was probably the most amazing musical foundation. That said, I'd already had a little bit of practice learning piano, and my mother had spent a few cents there, and that's a bit of an interesting story in itself.
Now tell us a bit of your faith journey. How did you come to Christ?
So I was very fortunate to grow up within a Christian family. I think if there was a startling conversion experience, it had probably been in my parents' generation. My father and his brother had grown up as in the Methodist family, but they'd both at university had a really solid encounter with Jesus, and they'd become very strong evangelicals, to the extent where my uncle then went on to start a Christian bookstore called Coorong, which you listeners may have heard of.
We may have heard of Coorong, yeah.
So, which my cousin ran for many years. And my father, similarly, a strong conversion experience, and my mother as well. So she had grown up a child of the Depression, an orphan, and in Newcastle one day there, in an adoptive family, a very, very tough background that she'd had. She moved, she was walking along the street one day, walked into the church army and became a Christian and learnt all about Jesus. So we were raised within the Christian background, within a Christian family. But I think one of the things which happens there is that, and perhaps I can use a metaphor here, I love gardening, and I have a little place down the coast, and I put a lot of time putting plants in. But I know that if we don't water them, they don't particularly grow. So I was fortunate enough to listen to Billy Graham and to sit through a huge number of sermons which told me about my need to become a Christian, but it was the growth which happened thereafter which is really important. And in my garden I spent a lot of time watering plants, because I know that if you don't do that, they'll never grow. No matter how good the gum tree, if you don't put that water in. And so I think the later Christian experience, and I had a couple of people who mentored me and looked after me, that's what made all the difference. So
that's wonderful. And I know that you mentioned to me before that there was also a connection with the Welsh revival with one of your relatives. Tell us a bit about that.
Indeed. So my aunt had grown up in Wales, and she had made a decision to become a Christian in the Welsh revival, a huge thing in the early 1900s throughout Wales, and that brought a massive change. And so she'd become a Christian, and then she'd met my uncle at university, one of the first people to do science there, one of the science degrees at Sydney University, and they had been very strong Christians all of their life.
I love hearing stories about the Welsh revival. I remember someone preaching once and sharing that so many people came to Christ that many of the pubs went out of business, and the police had nothing to do because the crime levels dropped so much. So the police started barbershop quartets and started singing at the revival meetings. So great to hear a connection there with the Welsh revival with Evan Roberts. He was only 28 apparently, a young revivalist, which is awesome. All right, now let's find out a bit more of your story. So you were following Jesus as a young fella. Tell us a bit about your early career. What did you do after school?
I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do, so I did a stack of different things. I did leave what we would call our HSC again, and I got all of, I think, 20 marks better. Not a lot, but that was enough to get me into university. But before I did that, I worked on the railways for a year. I worked as a motorbike courier for 3 months until I worked out that was a very short lifespan, so I moved on from there. And I worked in a bank part-time for a while whilst I was in a local school teaching scripture. And I was working with one of those people who mentored me, and they had a huge impact on my life. And as I was looking at that, I thought, well, I've watched people have had a big impact on my life, so I think I want to be working with others in the same way. So I had spent some time at the conservatorium. I went there and did part of the course, but I swapped to Macquarie University in Sydney, and I did an ancient history degree and English Lit, and I followed that with honours in New Testament, which I loved doing because really digging down into the Bible there. And then finally I went out teaching, and they sent me out to one of the worst schools in New South Wales, one of the toughest places ever to learn your trade, and yet one of the neediest places as well. So I got straight into there with the Christian group, and we were taking the kids out and travelling around. So I've worked at a variety of schools since then.
And what town was that in?
Yeah, so that was out there in Blacktown in the west of Sydney.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
And that was it was a rough old place, that one.
Yeah.
But it was also one for which I treasure some pretty good memories too.
And tell us a bit about your musical career. Firstly, how many instruments do you play? I saw a list before of several instruments.
Yeah. Look, I tend not to play things in the string family. Ironically, my grandfather used to make violins, but I'm always willing to have a go at anything in the wind or the brass family. So at the conservatorium, I did trumpet there. I trained as a classical tenor, so I've sung opera, but also piano was the biggest thing from the beginning. But in church, whatever instruments needed, I'll pull out the saxophone or the flute or whatever's required. So depends what works for a particular song. So yeah.
Now you've obviously performed in many secular shows and in the music world. Tell us about the ministry side of things. How did that develop with music ministry?
Well, that was a bit of a conscious decision. There were opportunities to continue on with that. I've worked on the club circuit. I've played piano restaurants. And I could have taken the singing on with the opera further, trained in the bel canto style, which is quite rare. But I think for me, the great passion was writing Christian music, which will inspire people. In the last few years, I've been working particularly on Christmas carols because there's a huge need, and we do live in a post-Christian era, unfortunately, and and in teaching I've discovered that there are so many people out there for whom sadly the name Jesus is nothing more than a swear word, which is a great sadness to me. So there is a way with Christmas carols that you can connect with people and you can introduce the message of Jesus, and that takes us out to a huge field of need. So that's been a particular passion of mine in the last few years.
And I've noticed that one of your songs, Christmas is Here Again, has been featured on an album with Pauline. She's well known from Australian Idol. Yep. And there's also been a whole bunch of your songs on Spotify, and that have been quite widely sung around the world.
Yes.
Lots of different Christmas carols events. Tell us a bit about this project.
So, Christmas is Here Again. I started with some words from Reginald Heber from 200 years ago. He's the guy who wrote Holy, Holy, Holy. And he wrote this beautiful Christmas carol. But it's not really accessible for a lot of people today, and some of the words and the images don't necessarily make a lot of sense. So, at a risk of for those people who are purists, I have worked with that quite hard, but and worked it over a period of time. But then I introduced at the beginning of it a song which almost sounds secular. So Christmas is Here Again, bring out the stockings and all the rest of it. And this Christmas carol just merges into the statement of what Christianity, what the central part of Christmas is about. But at the same time, I've worked fairly hard on the melody because that's one of my great passions. I love a song, and any song by anybody, where people are still singing that tune an hour later or the next day. So we've worked really hard on that. My producer, Pete from Turnaround Music, is very good mates with Graham Press, who runs the Christmas carols down in Sydney, which you'll see every year. And so Graham passed it on to Marisia, who is very famous and records with Andre Roux, and has also sung with the Seekers. And she loved the song, and so she recorded it for us, and hence it's moved on from there.
Fantastic. Now, I'm also curious to know about a youth Christian rock song you've written called Ever Living Rock. Tell us about this one.
Well, I was listening to some of the music that the kids were doing in our chapel band at the school I was teaching at the time, and I thought to myself, when I was younger, there were some really strong beats. I loved Keith Green, and it had an enormous effect on me.
Me too. Yeah.
And
have you got a favourite Keith Green song while we're on that topic?
I love every single one, and I loved his first cassette,
Yes.
and I played it and wore it out, and I'm always grateful to my sister that she left it sitting on the side table one day.
Yeah.
I had a cassette player, and from the time I put it on, I don't think I stopped playing it until it was completely gone.
Yeah.
That's probably why I bought the first Sony Walkman. Sorry, that's an archaic technical advice, but so. Yeah, when I was younger, you'd have great rock songs, Christian rock songs, which have a great drive to them, a great beat to them, and fantastic words. And I was listening, and I thought, well, why don't I do something like that?
Yeah.
And I was wonderful. I had a little tutor group, and every single person in that tutor group played an instrument. We had a full band there. So I said to the person around chapel, what if I put a song together? And we do it in chapel. And so that's been one of the used by the school I was working at.
Fantastic. And I'm also curious to know about another song, Bells Are Ringing. It was selected for the BBC Christmas concert, which didn't actually go ahead because of COVID, but it was, it's also been sung quite widely around the world.
Yes. So that was looking very good.
Yeah.
So we had... it had been selected by a company which the BBC puts that concert out to other groups, and they look after a lot of things contracted out these days. So it was looking good for COVID. They had the cast of Mamma Mia lined up to do that.
Wow.
So and I was very excited by that one, but of course COVID hit.
Yeah.
And it's very easy with COVID to sit there and think, woe is me, and all the things, you can look at all the things that go wrong, but that happened to everybody. And there were so many people affected around the world by that. So that was disappointing, but we're still looking at what we can do into the future. There may still be possibilities in that space. So
wonderful. You've got Christian youth songs, you've got Christmas carols, and you also do church music. So people sing a lot of your songs in churches.
Yes,
do they?
yes. So that's around the world. At the moment, it's probably bigger in the United States and England. I was just looking at CCLI came out today, and there was so there's quite a bit of use over there.
Yeah, great, fantastic. And tell us a bit about how you write them, because some songwriters, it comes to them in the shower or when they're out in nature or when they wake up in the morning. How do you get your inspiration for your songwriting?
Well, sometimes it just comes to you very quickly. There's a song I wrote which got used in Katoomba Youth Convention, which was pretty big back in the 1980s.
I've been there. I've been to the KYC. Yeah.
So that one was called All My Desire, and I wrote that in 15 minutes. And I was we're in a house church at the time, and one of the guys was just talking, and in the Gospel of John I'd never really understood, and he was unlocking it, and I realised how that's such a personal level that Gospel operates at. People want to turn it into theory sometimes, and I think, no, this is a man who passionately loves God. And so as he was talking about the relationship that Jesus had with God, I thought that I was just sitting there writing down the words. I went home and put the tune together in about 15 minutes. Other times it can take 6 months to put something together, or even a year. And there's times I've come back to something after 10, 15 years and reworked it to... So sometimes I start with a melody, and I'll be working on that for quite some time. Other times, though, I'll be listening to words. So for a while I was in a church in King's Cross in Sydney, which was really powerful. There was a story there of a man who he'd made all the newspapers because of it, all the gossip magazines, because of what had happened, and he'd run off with somebody, very famous story at the time. I won't go into the details, but he'd then caught AIDS. And at the end of his life, he'd become a Christian. And the minister was preaching because he'd been ministering to him in the last days of his life. And just some of the words that he said to that minister were so powerful. And as I heard those words, I wrote them down. And the title's a little bit controversial because it's called The Love of God is Sorrow. But the love of God was sorrow when his son was being crucified on the cross. But the final words of that song, these last years are much better than the ones that came before. Yeah, the word for word, what that man who'd become a Christian in the very final days was saying, as he was there in the most terrible circumstance. AIDS is a dreadful disease, and in those days very little could be done for the sufferer. And yet the powerful, the body was gone, but suddenly the spirit and the soul was incredibly strong. So listening to people preach, reading the Bible, there are just so many different sources of inspiration. And sometimes I'll start with words and just work at them, and the melody will then come to match the words. So it can come in from either direction, melody first, then words, sometimes words. And sometimes I have collaborated with others too and say, we've got a tune here, not quite sure what's happening with this. What do you think? So I'm always open to somebody coming in and looking at that as well.
Wonderful. And so if people want to book you to come and sing, you obviously do Christmas carols.
Indeed, yeah.
You lead worship as well, do you? Is that...
I do lead worship, and always happy to come and teach songs as well to people who want to do something new and who want to have a listen, particularly like a song. So,
and
yes.
what about training for music teams, worship teams? That kind
Absolutely.
Of thing? Yeah. Great.
That's an incredibly important thing. But and I'm passionate about this because often today what can happen is that leading church worship can become a concert. And sometimes the focus becomes maybe on the singers as well, whereas it has always got to be on God. Jesus has always got to be central. And what the church musicians do is to supplement and to complement and to help raise that praise up to another level. So that's something I'm passionate about. I've got a variety of backgrounds there because I sang in a cathedral choir, but I've also done lots of different styles. And I think that brings a sort of a unique experience together with all of those disparate backgrounds. And that's why I'm passionate to help churches and encourage them in developing songs and music and worship styles which enhance the worship of people of God.
Wonderful. If people want to find out more, they can go to the website jonsecombemusic.com, and that's John without an H.
That's John without an H.
JonSeccombe music.com. So jonsecombemusic.com, or you can search up Jon Seccombe Music on Facebook, Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube,
all there.
All the socials.
It's on all of those things, yes.
Fantastic. Well, it's been wonderful to hear your story today, John. I reckon you're a history maker. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much, Matt. Pleasure.